I'm begging you, mister. I don't need nothing for myself, just my boy. Please, just feed my child." Those words stopped Eli Crowder dead in his tracks on a frozen Wyoming trail in 1874. A woman he'd never seen before collapsed at his horse's feet, clutching a fever-burning child against her chest. Her eyes held something Eli recognized too well, the kind of desperation that comes when you've got one breath left and nowhere else to turn. What happened next would change everything he thought he knew about survival, redemption, and what it means to finally come home. But before we dive into this story, if you're enjoying it, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The wind cut across the high plains like a knife that November evening, carrying with it the promise of early snow. Eli Crowder sat deep in his saddle, collar turned up against the cold, watching the last red strips of sunlight bleed out along the western horizon. His ranch lay another hour's ride ahead, a small, sturdy place he'd built with his own hands after the war, when building something felt like the only way to forget what he'd torn down. He was a man of 32 who looked 40, with lines carved deep around his eyes and a beard more gray than brown. The war had done that. The war and what came after. The trail home was familiar, worn smooth by his horse's hooves over 5 years of the same routine. Check the fences on the northern pasture, ride into town for supplies once a month, speak to no one more than necessary, and return to the silence of his land. It was a good life for a man who'd decided he was done with people. That's why the shape in the road ahead didn't register at first. Eli squinted against the dying light, thinking it might be a fallen tree branch or maybe a deer carcass left by wolves. But as his horse drew closer, the shape moved, shifted with an effort that looked painful even from a distance. It was a woman. She was on her hands and knees in the middle of the trail trying to push herself upright. Her dress was torn and mud-stained, her dark hair hanging loose and tangled around her shoulders, and in her arms, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a child. Eli's first instinct was to ride around her. His second was to keep going and pretend he'd seen nothing at all. But his horse had already slowed, sensing something wrong, and by the time Eli's mind caught up with his body, he was pulling to a stop 15 feet from where she knelt. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, unused to speaking aloud after days alone. The woman's head snapped up. Her face was pale, almost gray, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and empty days. She couldn't have been more than 25, but she wore exhaustion like a much older woman. "Please," the word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Please, She tried to stand, got one foot under her, and then her legs gave out entirely. She crumpled forward, and Eli moved without thinking, swinging down from his saddle and crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He caught her before she hit the ground, his hands gripping her shoulders as she clutched the child tighter to her chest. Up close, he could see she was shaking, not just from cold, though the temperature was dropping fast, but from something deeper. Hunger, maybe. Or fear. "Easy now," Eli said, his voice softer this time. "I got you." "My boy," she gasped, her eyes wild and unfocused. "He's sick. He's burning up, and I don't know what to do. We've been walking for days, and I thought maybe—" Her words dissolved into a coughing fit that shook her entire frame. The child in her arms stirred and let out a weak, mewling cry that made Eli's chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Let me see him," Eli said. The woman hesitated, her arms tightening protectively around the bundle. Her eyes met his, brown eyes full of a mother's terror, and Eli saw the calculation happening behind them. Trust a stranger or watch her child die. Some choice. "I'm not going to hurt him," Eli said quietly. "Or you. I just need to see how bad off he is." Something in his tone must have reached her, because slowly, carefully, she loosened her grip enough for Eli to pull back a corner of the blanket. The boy couldn't have been more than 3 years old. His face was flushed with fever, his small chest rising and falling too quickly, and even in the fading light, Eli could see the glisten of sweat on his forehead. The child's eyes were closed, his little body limp except for the occasional twitch or whimper. "How long's he been like this?" 2 days, the woman whispered. "Maybe 3. I lost track. He was fine, and then he just He started burning up, and I couldn't make it stop. I tried everything I know. I tried. Her voice broke, and Eli felt something crack open inside his chest. Something he'd boarded up and buried deep after Shiloh. After he'd come home to find his own house empty and his own family gone. "What's your name?" he asked. "Hannah." She swallowed hard. "Hannah Reed, and this is Samuel, my Sam. I'm Eli Crowder. My ranch is about an hour west of here." He straightened up, making his decision before he could talk himself out of it. "You can't stay out here tonight. Temperature's going to drop below freezing, and the boy needs to be somewhere warm." Hannah's eyes widened. I don't have any money. I can't pay you, but I could work. I'm strong. I can do whatever you need. Clean, cook, mend. I don't eat much. I barely eat at all. Just feed my child. Please. He's all I got left in this world." There it was again. That desperation that lived in her voice like a second heartbeat. Eli looked down at her, this woman on her knees in the dirt, begging him for mercy she probably shouldn't expect from a stranger on a lonely trail. He thought about all the reasons he should say no. Thought about the complications and the questions and the way people in town would talk. Then he thought about the boy's fever-bright face and the way Hannah's hand shook as she held him. "Get up," Eli said, offering his hand. "Both of you are coming with me." The ride to the ranch was slow and difficult. Hannah was too weak to sit a horse on her own, so Eli had her ride in front of him, the child cradled between them. She was light, too light, and he could feel every bone in her back through the thin fabric of her dress. When was the last time this woman had eaten a real meal? She didn't speak during the ride, and neither did Eli. What was there to say? He kept one arm around her waist to keep her steady, and she kept both arms locked around Samuel, whispering things Eli couldn't hear against the boy's fevered forehead. The ranch appeared in the darkness like a promise kept. It wasn't much. A small house, a barn, a corral for the horses, and a well that still ran clear even in dry summers. But it was solid and real, built by Eli's own hands from timber he'd cut and stones he'd hauled. He'd meant it to be a home once. Now it was just a place where he slept between long days of work that kept his mind too busy to remember. Eli dismounted first, then reached up to help Hannah down. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the ground, and he caught her again, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. "Barn's warmer than the house right now," he said. "I'll get you settled there for tonight." "The barn's fine," Hannah said quickly. "More than fine. We don't need... Come on." The barn smelled of hay and horses and leather, good, honest smells that Eli had always found more comforting than the emptiness of the house. He led Hannah to a clean corner where he'd stored fresh straw just that morning, and she sank down onto it with a grateful sound that was almost a sob. Samuel was still unconscious, his small body hot to the touch. Eli had seen enough sickness in the war to know this could go either way. The boy might pull through, or he might not. It all depended on what was causing the fever and whether his little body had enough fight left in it. "I'll bring blankets," Eli said, "and water. You need to get fluids in him however you can." Hannah nodded, not looking up from her son's face. Her hands were trembling as she brushed the dark hair back from his forehead. Eli turned to go, then stopped. "When's the last time you ate?" I'm not hungry." "That wasn't what I asked." She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Eli walked back to the house, moving through the dark rooms by memory. He lit a lamp, pulled blankets from the chest at the foot of his bed, and went to the kitchen to see what food he had. Not much. Some dried beef, beans, a half loaf of bread from town that was only a little stale. He put together a plate, filled a canteen with water from the pump, and carried it all back to the barn. Hannah hadn't moved. She was sitting exactly as he'd left her, staring down at Samuel with an expression that made Eli's throat tight. "Here," he set the plate and water beside her. "You need to eat." "I told you, I'm not. Your boy's sick, and you're not going to do him any good if you collapse." Eli's voice came out harder than he meant it to. "Eat. I'm not asking." For a moment he thought she might argue, but then she picked up the bread with shaking hands and took a small, careful bite. She chewed slowly, deliberately, like she was afraid her stomach might reject it. Eli watched her eat 3 bites of bread before she set it down and turned her attention back to Samuel. She dipped her fingers in the water and pressed them to the boy's lips, coaxing a few drops into his mouth. "That's good," Eli said. "Keep doing that. And try to get him to drink more when he wakes. If he wakes." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. "He will," Eli said with more confidence than he felt. "Kids are tougher than they look." Hannah's eyes came up to meet his, and in the lamplight he could see tears tracking down her dirty cheeks. "Why are you helping us?" It was a fair question. Eli didn't have a good answer for it. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "And because—" He stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything? Because I've got a barn full of empty space and a house that echoes with ghosts? Because for just one moment, when I looked at your boy's face, I remembered what it felt like to have someone depend on me?" "Just get some rest," Eli said instead. "I'll check on you in a few hours." He left before she could thank him, before she could ask any more questions he didn't want to answer. Back in the house, he sat at his table in the dark and told himself this was temporary. One night, maybe two. Until the boy was strong enough to travel and the woman could get to wherever she was going. That's what he told himself. But deep down, in a part of his heart he thought he'd buried years ago, Eli knew that nothing about tonight felt temporary at all. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat by the window and watched the barn, waiting for what? A cry for help? A sign that things had gone wrong? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that leaving two strangers alone in his barn while a child fought for his life felt wrong somehow. Around midnight, he gave up on pretending he wasn't going to check on them. He pulled on his coat and crossed the yard, moving quietly so as not to wake them if they'd managed to sleep. The barn door creaked slightly as he pushed it open. Inside, the lamp still burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Hannah was awake. Sitting with her back against a post, Samuel cradled in her arms. She was singing, so softly Eli almost couldn't hear it, some lullaby he didn't recognize. She looked up when she heard him, her eyes red from crying but no longer quite so wild with panic. "He drank some water," she whispered. "About an hour ago." He opened his eyes for just a second and took a few sips. Relief flooded through Eli's chest. "That's good. That's real good. I've been trying to keep him cool, but I don't know if I'm doing it right. I don't know anything anymore." Eli crossed the barn and knelt beside them, pressing the back of his hand to Samuel's forehead. The fever was still there, but it felt slightly less intense than before. Maybe. It was hard to tell. "You're doing fine," he said. "Just keep getting water in him when you can." Hannah nodded, but she looked exhausted, beyond exhausted, like she'd been running on nothing but fear and willpower for so long that her body had forgotten how to rest. "You should sleep," Eli said. "I can watch him for a while." No, I can't. What if he needs me?" "Then I'll wake you, but you're no good to him if you're too tired to stand." She looked like she wanted to argue, but her body was already betraying her. Her eyes kept drooping closed, then snapping open again, fighting sleep with everything she had left. "Just for an hour," Eli said quietly. "I'll stay right here, I promise." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because slowly, reluctantly, she shifted Samuel into Eli's arms. The boy was lighter than he should be, his small body burning with heat even through the blanket. Hannah lay down on the straw beside them, curling into herself. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Eli sat there in the lamplight, holding a stranger's sick child, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like an old, familiar coat. He'd felt this before. In the war, when he'd been responsible for the young soldiers in his unit. And before that, in another life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. He looked down at Samuel's face, at the way the boy's small hand had curled into a fist against his chest, and felt something shift inside him. Something that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it could thaw. "You're gonna be all right, kid," he whispered, not sure if he was trying to convince the boy or himself. "Your mama's not gonna let anything happen to you, and I guess, for tonight at least, neither am I." Samuel stirred slightly in his arms, his fever-bright face turning toward Eli's chest as if searching for comfort. Without thinking, Eli began to hum, low and quiet, an old tune his own mother had sung to him a lifetime ago. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn doors and carrying with it the first flakes of snow. Winter was coming early this year, but inside, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses and the quiet breathing of two people who'd stumbled into his life by chance, Eli felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt needed, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a terrible thing after all. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink that filtered through the barn's high windows. Eli had dozed off at some point, his back against the post, Samuel still cradled in his arms. He woke to the sound of Hannah stirring beside him. She sat up quickly, panic flashing across her face. "Sam, he's fine," Eli said quickly. "Fever broke about an hour before dawn. He's sleeping now, real sleep, not fever sleep." Hannah's eyes filled with tears again. But these were different. These were relief and gratitude and something else Eli couldn't quite name. She reached out with trembling hands, and Eli carefully transferred Samuel back to her arms. The boy looked better. His color was closer to normal, and his breathing had evened out. He was still thin and weak, but the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. "Thank you," Hannah whispered, pressing her lips to her son's forehead. "Thank you, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Eli said, getting stiffly to his feet. His back protested the night spent on the barn floor. "He's still weak. Needs food and rest. And you." He looked at Hannah, taking in her hollow cheeks and the way her dress hung on her frame. "You need the same." "We'll be out of your way soon as he can travel," Hannah said quickly. "I don't want to be any trouble." "Where are you headed?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked away, her arms tightening around Samuel. "West. I thought, there's supposed to be work in the mining towns. Cooking, laundry. I'm good with my hands." "Those mining camps are no place for a woman alone," Eli said flatly, "especially not with a child." "I don't have anywhere else to go." The words came out flat and final, and Eli heard the whole story in them. Whatever Hannah was running from, whatever had put her on that trail alone with a sick child, she'd reached the end of every other option. "All right," he said after a moment, "here's what's going to happen. You and the boy are going to stay here until he's strong enough to travel proper. Could be a few days, could be a week. You can have the barn. I'll make it more comfortable. And I'll bring you food. You don't work for it. You don't owe me for it. You just rest and take care of your son." Hannah stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Why would you do that?" Eli thought about all the reasons he probably shouldn't. Thought about his carefully constructed solitude and the life he'd built around keeping people at arm's length. Thought about how much easier it would be to point her toward town, maybe give her a few dollars and send her on her way. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was, "Because you need help, and because I've got space going to waste anyway." It wasn't the whole truth, wasn't even close, but it was all Eli was prepared to admit out loud. Hannah's eyes searched his face, looking for the catch, the hidden price, the ulterior motive. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "Just until Sam's strong," she said. "Then we'll go. I promise we won't be any trouble." Eli almost laughed at that. These two had been trouble from the moment he'd spotted them on the trail, but it was the kind of trouble that reminded him what it felt like to be human again, and maybe, just maybe, that was worth something. "Get some more sleep," he said, heading for the door. "I'll bring breakfast in an hour." As he crossed the yard back to the house, snowflakes were starting to fall in earnest, covering the ground in a thin white blanket. The first snow of the season. Eli tilted his face up to the sky and let the cold flakes melt against his skin. Behind him, in the barn, a woman who'd been prepared to beg for her child's life was finally resting, and a boy who'd been burning with fever was breathing easy again. It was just one night, just one act of basic human decency. But as Eli stood there in the falling snow, feeling the weight of another person's trust settling on his shoulders, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Some door he'd thought was permanently closed had cracked open again, letting in a sliver of light he'd learned to live without. He told himself it didn't mean anything, told himself that in a week or two they'd be gone and his life would return to normal. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to examine too closely, Eli suspected nothing would ever be quite the same again. And standing there in the snow, watching smoke rise from his chimney and listening to the quiet sounds of morning on his land, he found he didn't entirely mind. But Inside the house, Eli stood at his stove, frying eggs and bacon with more care than he usually bothered with. He cut bread into thick slices and set coffee to boil, trying to remember the last time he'd cooked for anyone but himself. The answer came unbidden, 5 years ago, before he'd left for the war. His wife, Sarah, had been pregnant with their first child. He'd made her breakfast every morning, watching her eat with the kind of focused attention that came from knowing he might not get many more chances. He'd been right about that, though not in the way he'd feared. Eli shook his head, pushing the memories away. This wasn't about Sarah or the child he'd never met. This was about a woman who needed help and a boy who deserved to live. That was all. That was enough. He loaded everything onto a tray, more food than Hannah and Samuel could possibly eat, but he figured she needed to build her strength back up. Then he pulled on his coat again and headed back out into the snow. The barn felt warmer this time, or maybe that was just knowing that the people inside were safe and resting. Hannah was awake, sitting with her back against the post, watching Samuel sleep. She looked up when Eli entered, something wary still in her eyes, but also something softer. Gratitude, maybe. Or just bone-deep exhaustion finally beginning to ease. "Brought breakfast," Eli said, setting the tray down beside her. "It's not fancy, but it's hot." Hannah stared at the food like she couldn't quite believe it was real. Her hand reached out, then hesitated, pulling back. "It's all right," Eli said quietly. "Go ahead." She picked up the fork with trembling fingers and took a bite of eggs. Her eyes closed, and a sound escaped her throat that might have been a sob or a sigh of relief. She ate slowly, carefully, like her body wasn't quite sure what to do with real food after going without for so long. Eli busied himself with checking Samuel while she ate, giving her privacy to be hungry without being watched. The boy was definitely improving. His color was better, and when Eli touched his forehead, the fever was barely there, just a lingering warmth that would probably fade completely by evening. "He looks better," Hannah said between bites. "He looks—" Her voice caught. "He looks like my Sam again." "He's a fighter," Eli said. "Takes after his mama, I'd guess." A ghost of a smile crossed Hannah's face, there and gone so quickly Eli almost missed it. His father always said Sam was stubborn as a mule. Wouldn't take no for an answer about anything. It was the first time she'd mentioned Samuel's father. Eli waited to see if she'd say more, but she just kept eating, her eyes fixed on her son. "Where's his father now?" Eli asked, keeping his voice casual. The fork paused halfway to Hannah's mouth. Her face went carefully blank, the kind of blank that meant the answer was complicated and painful and none of Eli's business. "Gone," she said finally. "That's all that matters." Fair enough. Everyone had their secrets. Eli certainly had his. "Listen," he said, straightening up, "I meant what I said earlier. You and the boy can stay here until he's strong enough to travel proper, but the barn's going to be cold once winter really sets in. I've been thinking, the house has a spare room, nothing fancy, but it's got a real bed and a stove. Might be better for the boy." Hannah's eyes widened. "I couldn't. That's too much. We're fine here, really. We've slept in worse places." "I'm sure you have. But you don't have to anymore, not while you're here." She studied him with those tired brown eyes, searching for something. "Why are you being so kind to us? You don't even know us." Eli thought about how to answer that. The truth was complicated, wrapped up in guilt and grief and the memory of coming home to an empty house and promises he'd been too late to keep. But Hannah didn't need to hear any of that. "Maybe I just don't like seeing people suffer when I can help," he said. "Or maybe I'm just tired of rattling around in that house alone. Does it matter?" "I suppose not," Hannah said softly. "But we won't forget this. When we leave, I'll find a way to pay you back somehow. Don't worry about that. Just focus on getting your boy healthy." Samuel stirred then, his small body shifting in Hannah's arms. His eyes fluttered open, real consciousness this time, not fever dreams. He looked up at his mother's face, confused and disoriented. "Mama?" His voice was barely a whisper, rough and small. "I'm here, baby," Hannah said, her whole face transforming with relief and love. "Mama's right here. I don't feel good. I know, sweetheart. But you're getting better. You just need to rest." Samuel's eyes drifted around the barn, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with a child's vague concern. Then his gaze landed on Eli, and he shrank back against his mother. "Who's that?" "That's Mr. Crowder," Hannah said gently. "He's helping us. He gave us a place to stay while you were sick." Samuel studied Eli with serious dark eyes. "Are you nice?" The question caught Eli off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked him that? When was the last time it had mattered? "I try to be," Eli said, crouching down so he was at the boy's eye level. "And you can call me Eli. Mr. Crowder makes me feel old." "My papa wasn't nice," Samuel said with the blunt honesty of a young child. "He was mean. He made Mama cry." "Sam," Hannah said sharply, her face flushing, "that's enough." But the boy wasn't finished. "Are you going to make Mama cry?" Eli looked at this small, serious child who'd just fought off a fever that might have killed him and felt something crack open in his chest. This boy had learned young that men could be dangerous, that kindness couldn't be trusted, that sometimes the people who should protect you were the ones you needed protecting from. "No," Eli said quietly. "I'm not going to make your mama cry. You have my word on that." Samuel considered this for a long moment, then nodded as if Eli had passed some important test. "Okay, can I have some eggs?" Just like that, the heavy moment broke. Hannah laughed, a real laugh this time, not the bitter sound of earlier, and Eli felt himself smile in response. "Yeah, kid," he said, standing up. "You can have some eggs." He left them there, Hannah feeding her son small bites of breakfast, both of them looking more alive than they had when he'd found them on that trail, and headed back to the house to start his day's work. But as he walked across the yard, Eli couldn't shake the memory of Samuel's question. "Are you nice?" Such a simple thing for a child to ask. Such a complicated thing for Eli to answer. He'd spent 5 years convincing himself that he was better off alone, that connecting with people only led to loss and pain. He'd built walls around his heart and told himself they were necessary for survival. But maybe, just maybe, survival wasn't the same thing as living. Maybe there was something to be said for letting people in, even when it scared him, even when it meant risking the kind of hurt he'd sworn he'd never feel again. Eli looked back at the barn, at the thin line of smoke rising from the small stove he'd lit inside, and felt the weight of possibility settling over him. One night had turned into a day. A day might turn into a week. And a week? Well, Eli tried not to think about what a week might turn into. For now, he had work to do. Fences to check, animals to tend, a life to maintain. But for the first time in 5 years, that life didn't feel quite so empty. And that, Eli thought as he headed toward the barn to start his morning chores, was something worth holding on to, even if he didn't quite know what to do with it yet. 3 days passed before Eli finally convinced Hannah to move into the house. She'd resisted at first, insisting the barn was perfectly adequate, that she didn't want to intrude any more than she already had. But when the temperature dropped well below freezing on the third night and Samuel started coughing again, Eli didn't give her a choice. He simply showed up at the barn with blankets, scooped the boy into his arms, and started walking toward the house. Hannah had followed without another word of protest. The spare room was small, barely large enough for the narrow bed and washstand Eli had moved in from storage, but it was warm and dry and infinitely better than sleeping on straw. Hannah stood in the doorway that first night, staring at the room like she couldn't quite believe it was real, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "The door locks from the inside," Eli said quietly, showing her the simple latch. "You don't have to use it, but it's there if it makes you feel safer." Something flickered across Hannah's face, relief mixed with a sadness that suggested she'd learned the hard way why locked doors mattered. She nodded once, not meeting his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli left them to settle in, closing the door to his own room at the far end of the short hallway. He lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of other people in his house, the creak of floorboards as Hannah moved around, the soft murmur of her voice as she sang Samuel to sleep, the quiet that followed, different somehow from the silence he'd grown accustomed to. It should have felt like an intrusion. Instead, it felt like something long dead was slowly coming back to life. By the fourth morning, a routine had begun to establish itself without anyone planning it. Eli rose before dawn, as always, started coffee on the stove, and was halfway through frying eggs when Hannah appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked better than she had on the trail. Her face had some color now, and her eyes didn't hold quite the same desperate edge. But she still moved with the careful wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust good fortune. "You don't have to cook for us," she said, hovering at the threshold like she wasn't sure she was allowed to enter. "I'm cooking for myself anyway," Eli replied without turning around. "Might as well make extra." "Then let me help." "You should rest. I've been resting for 3 days." Hannah's voice took on a stubborn quality that Eli was beginning to recognize. "I need to do something useful, or I'll go out of my mind." Eli glanced over his shoulder at her. She was wearing the same dress she'd arrived in, now clean but still worn thin in places, patched and repatched so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her hands were clasped together in front of her like she was physically restraining herself from reaching for the pan. He understood that need. After the war, after Sarah, he'd nearly worked himself to death just to avoid sitting still with his own thoughts. "All right," he said, stepping aside, "but I'm not going to have you passing out at my stove. You eat first, then you can help with lunch." A ghost of a smile crossed Hannah's face, the second time Eli had seen her come close to that expression. Deal. They fell into a pattern after that. Hannah would emerge from the spare room in the morning to find Eli already making breakfast, and they'd eat together in a silence that grew gradually less awkward with each passing day. Then Eli would head out to handle the ranch work, checking fences, tending the horses, chopping wood for the stoves, while Hannah stayed inside with Samuel. But Hannah couldn't seem to stay idle. Eli would come in for lunch and find that she'd swept the floors. The next day, the dishes were washed and stacked with military precision. By the end of the first week, she'd scrubbed the kitchen table until the old wood gleamed, mended a tear in his coat he'd been meaning to fix for months, and reorganized his pantry in a way that actually made sense. "You don't have to do all this," Eli said one afternoon, finding her on her knees scrubbing the floor despite the fact that he'd explicitly told her to rest. Hannah sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her hand. "I need to earn my keep. I told you, you don't owe me. I know what you told me." Her voice was gentle but firm. "But I can't just sit here accepting charity while you work yourself half to death keeping this place running. It's not in me to do nothing." Eli recognized the stubborn set of her jaw. It was the same expression Samuel got when he decided he was going to do something regardless of what anyone said. "You've got a child to take care of. That's not nothing. Sam sleeps half the day while he's recovering. I've got time. Then use it to rest. Build your own strength back up." Hannah's eyes met his, and Eli saw something flicker there, a mix of pride and shame and something else he couldn't quite name. "I've been resting my whole life, waiting for things to get better, for someone to rescue me. I'm done waiting. If I'm going to be here, I'm going to make myself useful." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning Eli suspected went far deeper than a clean floor. He thought about arguing, about insisting again that she didn't owe him anything. But he also understood the bone-deep need to feel like you were contributing something, anything, to justify taking up space in the world. "Fine," he said finally, "but you work at your own pace. And if I catch you pushing yourself too hard, we're going to have words." That ghost of a smile appeared again, staying a little longer this time. "Yes, sir. And stop calling me sir. Makes me feel like I'm back in the army." "Yes, Eli." He left her to her scrubbing, shaking his head but unable to suppress a smile of his own. Stubborn woman. She reminded him of Sarah in that way. That same quiet determination that meant she'd run herself into the ground before admitting she needed help. The thought of his wife should have hurt. Usually did, like pressing on a bruise that never quite healed. But this time it just felt distant. Like a memory that belonged to someone else. Samuel was getting stronger every day. By the end of the first week, he was up and walking around, though he tired easily and still napped for hours each afternoon. He was a quiet child, too quiet, Eli thought, for a boy his age. But when he did speak, it was usually to ask questions. "Why don't you got a wife?" Samuel asked one morning, appearing at Eli's elbow while he was repairing a saddle in the barn. Eli's hand stilled on the leather. "Used to have one. She died while I was away at war." "Oh." Samuel considered this with a seriousness that seemed far too old for a 3-year-old. That's sad. Yeah, it is. Did you cry? The blunt question should have felt intrusive, but there was no malice in it, just genuine curiosity from a child who was still figuring out how the world worked. Yeah, Eli said quietly. I cried. Samuel nodded as if this made perfect sense. He watched Eli work for a few more minutes, then asked, Do you got any kids? This question hit harder. Eli's hands tightened on the saddle, and he had to force himself to keep breathing normally. No, I don't. How come? Because my wife was pregnant when I left for the war, and she died in childbirth before I made it home. Because I came back to an empty house and 2 graves in the churchyard. And sometimes I still wake up thinking I hear a baby crying. Because I've spent 5 years trying not to imagine what my child might have looked like. But Eli couldn't say any of that to a 3-year-old. Just didn't work out that way, he said instead. Samuel seemed to accept this. He wandered over to pet one of the horses, his small hand gentle on the animal's nose. I like it here, he said after a moment. It's nice. Mama doesn't cry as much. Eli's throat went tight. She cried a lot before? All the time, when Papa was around. After he left, she tried to hide it, but I could still hear her at night. Samuel looked back at Eli with those 2 serious eyes. She doesn't cry here. That means you're nice, right? Like you said? The trust in that question made Eli's chest ache. This boy had been through things no child should have to experience, and yet he was still trying to figure out if the world had safe spaces in it. Still hoping that maybe, just maybe, some people could be trusted. I hope so, kid, Eli said softly. I'm trying to be. Samuel smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. Good. Mama needs nice people. Then he was off again, distracted by a barn cat that had emerged from the hayloft. Eli watched him go, this small boy who was learning to be a child again now that he wasn't constantly afraid. That evening, Eli found Hannah in the kitchen preparing dinner. She'd insisted on taking over the evening meal, and he'd learned not to argue with her once she'd made up her mind about something. The smell of roasting chicken filled the house, a bird Eli had purchased in town the day before on the excuse that he'd been planning to cook it anyway. Sam told me you 2 talked today, Hannah said, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. He's full of questions. He likes you. She said it matter-of-factly, but Eli heard the weight behind it. He doesn't usually warm up to people so fast, especially not men. Eli leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. Her movements were efficient and practiced, the kind that came from years of cooking in difficult circumstances with limited resources. He asked about my wife. Hannah's knife paused for just a fraction of a second. I hope that was all right. I told him it wasn't polite to pry, but he doesn't always understand. It's fine, Eli interrupted. Kid's just curious. Nothing wrong with that. She resumed chopping, but Eli could see the tension in her shoulders. He said your wife died in the war. During it, anyway. Eli moved into the kitchen, pouring himself coffee from the pot that always seemed to be warm now that Hannah was around. I was gone when it happened. Didn't even know she'd passed until I came home. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Hannah glanced at him then, and something in her eyes suggested she understood that time didn't heal all wounds. It just taught you how to live with them. Still, I'm sorry you had to come home to that. They worked in companionable silence after that. Hannah cooking and Eli setting the table, a task he'd never bothered with when eating alone, but that seemed important now. When dinner was ready, Hannah called Samuel in from where he'd been playing with a carved horse Eli had found in a trunk of old belongings. They sat together at the table, Eli at one end, Hannah and Samuel at the other, and ate the best meal Eli had tasted in years. Hannah had somehow made that chicken tender and flavorful, and the vegetables were seasoned with herbs Eli didn't even know he had in his pantry. This is really good, he said, and meant it. Hannah ducked her head, but he caught the pleased flush that colored her cheeks. It's nothing special, just simple cooking. Mama's the best cook, Samuel announced through a mouthful of chicken. She can make anything taste good, even when we didn't have nothing but beans. Anything, not nothing, Hannah corrected gently. And don't talk with your mouth full. Samuel swallowed obediently, then grinned at Eli. Mama says I need to mind my manners so I can grow up to be a gentleman. Your mama's right, Eli said. Manners matter. Did you got good manners when you were little? Had, Hannah corrected. Did you have good manners? My mother tried to teach me, Eli said, fighting back a smile at the boy's earnest expression. But I was pretty wild as a kid, drove her half crazy. Samuel's eyes lit up. Really? What'd you do? And just like that, Eli found himself telling stories about his childhood, climbing trees he shouldn't have climbed, getting into scrapes with other boys, once getting chased by an angry bull after trying to ride it on a dare. Stories he hadn't thought about in years, maybe decades. Stories that made Samuel laugh and even coaxed a smile from Hannah. It felt good. Felt normal. It felt like something Eli had forgotten existed. This simple pleasure of sharing a meal and conversation with people who actually wanted to hear what he had to say. After dinner, while Hannah cleaned up despite Eli's protests, Samuel fell asleep in the chair by the fire, exhausted from his most active day yet. Eli carried him to bed, the boy's small body warm and trusting in his arms, and was surprised by how natural the gesture felt. Hannah appeared in the doorway as Eli was pulling the blankets up around Samuel's shoulders. She stood there watching, her expression soft and unguarded, in a way Eli had never seen before. Thank you, she said quietly once they'd left the room and closed the door. For everything, for being patient with him, for, her voice caught, for giving him a place where he feels safe enough to laugh again. He's a good kid, Eli said, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her voice. Easy to be around. He hasn't always been. Hannah wrapped her arms around herself, that defensive gesture Eli had come to recognize. When his father was around, Sam barely spoke at all. He learned early to be invisible, to not draw attention. It's good to see him acting like a child again. There it was again, that reference to Samuel's father, wrapped in implications that made Eli's jaw tighten. He wanted to ask, wanted to know what exactly this woman and her boy were running from. But Hannah's body language screamed that the topic was closed, and Eli had learned to respect people's boundaries. Well, he's safe here, Eli said instead. Both of you are, for as long as you need. Hannah's eyes met his, searching for something. Why? She asked, not for the first time. Why are you doing this for us? Eli thought about the question. He'd been asking himself the same thing for days, trying to understand why two strangers had worked their way into his carefully ordered life so easily, why he'd let them. Maybe because I remember what it's like to need help and not have anywhere to turn, he said slowly. After the war, after I lost Sarah, I was barely holding on. If it hadn't been for a few people who gave me work and a reason to keep going, I don't know if I'd have made it. So you're paying it forward. Maybe. Or maybe... He stopped, not sure how to articulate the truth. Maybe I've been alone too long. Maybe having you and Sam here reminds me what it feels like to be part of something again. Hannah's expression softened. You must have been lonely. I told myself I preferred it that way, convinced myself that being alone was safer than risking... He gestured vaguely, unable to finish the sentence. Risking getting hurt again, Hannah finished quietly. I understand that. I've been telling myself the same thing. They stood there in the dim hallway, the only light coming from the fire in the main room, and Eli felt something shift between them. An understanding, maybe. A recognition that they'd both been broken by their pasts and were both trying to figure out how to keep moving forward. We should probably get some sleep, Hannah said finally, breaking the moment. Tomorrow's another day. Eli nodded, but neither of them moved. The silence stretched out, comfortable now, instead of awkward. Eli? Hannah's voice was barely above a whisper. I meant what I said earlier. About Sam not crying here. I'm not crying here either. I can't remember the last time I felt... She paused, searching for the word. Safe. Really, truly safe. So thank you for that. Before Eli could respond, she'd slipped past him into her room, closing the door softly behind her. He stood there for a long moment, staring at that closed door, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a blanket. Safe. Such a simple thing, such a necessary thing. And somehow, without meaning to, he'd given that to her. The realization made something warm unfold in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to purpose. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Eli woke to the smell of coffee already brewing and found Hannah in the kitchen, fully dressed and looking more rested than she had since arriving. She smiled when she saw him, a real smile this time, not the ghost of one. "Morning," she said. "I hope you don't mind, but I started breakfast. Figured I owed you after you've been cooking for us all week." "You don't owe me anything," Eli said automatically, but he was secretly pleased. The kitchen felt warmer with her in it, more alive somehow. They worked together preparing the meal, moving around each other with an ease that suggested they'd been doing this for months rather than days. Hannah cracked eggs while Eli sliced bread. He poured coffee while she flipped bacon. They didn't talk much, but the silence was companionable, comfortable. Samuel appeared just as they were setting food on the table, his hair sticking up in all directions and his eyes still heavy with sleep. He climbed into his chair without prompting and dug into his breakfast with the enthusiasm of a child who was finally healthy enough to have an appetite again. "Can I go outside today?" he asked between bites. "I want to see the horses." Hannah's expression immediately turned cautious. "I don't know, sweetheart. It's awfully cold. I'll bundle him up," Eli interrupted. "And I've got work to do in the barn anyway. He can come with me if that's all right with you." Hannah looked torn between her protective instincts and her desire to let her son be a normal child. "I don't want to burden you." "He's not a burden. I could use the company, actually. Gets quiet working alone all day." That seemed to decide it. Hannah nodded slowly. "All right. But you stay close to Eli, Sam, and if you start feeling tired or cold, you come right back inside. Understand?" "Yes, Mama." Samuel practically bounced in his chair with excitement. An hour later, Eli found himself working in the barn with a small shadow following his every move. Samuel was bundled in layers of clothing, most of it too big, borrowed from Eli's own wardrobe and rolled up at the sleeves and hems, and he watched everything Eli did with wide, fascinated eyes. "What are you doing?" Samuel asked as Eli began mucking out one of the stalls. "Cleaning up after the horses. They're messy animals. Can I help?" Eli looked at the boy's eager face and found himself nodding before he'd really thought it through. "Sure, but you're going to need to listen to what I say and do exactly what I tell you. Horses are big, and you've got to be careful around them." Samuel nodded seriously, taking this responsibility with the gravity it deserved. Eli found a smaller shovel and showed Samuel how to scoop the soiled straw into a wheelbarrow, warning him to watch out for the horses' hooves and never to come up behind them without warning. Samuel listened intently, his small face scrunched in concentration, and then set to work with more enthusiasm than skill. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of shovels and the soft nickering of horses. Eli found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years, the boy's presence somehow making the work feel less like a chore and more like something worth doing. "Eli," Samuel's voice was small but clear. "Yeah? Are you going to marry my mama?" Eli nearly dropped his shovel. "What? No, I mean, where'd you get that idea?" Samuel shrugged, completely unfazed by the question that had just sent Eli's heart racing. "You're nice to her, and you let us live here. That's what papas do, right?" Eli had no idea how to answer that. "It's more complicated than that, kid." "Why?" "Because..." Eli stopped, realizing he was trying to explain adult relationships to a 3-year-old. "Your mama and I barely know each other. Marriage is something that takes time." "Oh." Samuel considered this, then went back to shoveling. "Mama smiles more when you're around. I think she likes you." Eli's chest tightened. "Sam, your mama's just grateful for the help, that's all." "No, it's different." Samuel spoke with the absolute certainty that only children could muster. "When Papa was alive, she never smiled. She was always scared. But here she smiles for real." The casual mention of fear in the boy's voice made Eli's hands tighten on the shovel handle. Samuel was too young to understand what he was revealing, too innocent to know that every offhand comment painted a darker picture of the life he and Hannah had escaped. "Your papa's gone now," Eli said carefully. "You and your mama are safe here." "I know." Samuel grinned up at him. That's why she smiles. They finished the stall cleaning and moved on to other tasks. Eli showed Samuel how to brush the horses, letting him stand on a wooden crate to reach their flanks. The boy was gentle and patient, talking to the animals in a soft voice that reminded Eli painfully of his own childhood. Hannah appeared in the barn doorway around midday, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "I thought you two might be hungry," she called. Samuel abandoned his brushing and ran to her, chattering excitedly about everything he'd learned. Hannah listened with that soft expression Eli was starting to recognize, smoothing down her son's wild hair with one hand. "He's been a good helper," Eli said, joining them. "Natural with the horses." "Really?" Hannah looked surprised and pleased. "Sam, that's wonderful." They ate lunch together in the barn, sandwiches and coffee for the adults, milk and cookies for Samuel. The boy ate quickly and then wandered off to play in the hayloft, leaving Eli and Hannah sitting on hay bales in the weak winter sunlight that filtered through the high windows. "He's happy," Hannah said softly, watching her son play. "I'd forgotten what that looked like." "He's a good kid. Makes it easy." Hannah turned to look at Eli, her expression suddenly serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What you said last night about being alone, did you really mean it? About us reminding you what it feels like to be part of something?" Eli met her gaze, saw the vulnerability there. "Yeah, I meant it. Hannah looked down at her hands, picking at a loose thread on her dress. "I've been thinking about what happens when we leave, where we'll go." Something cold settled in Eli's stomach. "Have you decided on somewhere?" "No, that's the problem. I've been lying awake at night trying to figure it out, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't want to go. Sam doesn't want to go. But we can't just stay here forever living off your charity." "It's not charity." "Then what is it?" Eli didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, he had several answers, and none of them felt safe to say out loud. Because the truth was that Hannah and Samuel had become part of his daily rhythm in a way that felt essential now. The house didn't feel empty anymore. His days had purpose beyond just surviving until the next one. "What if you stayed?" The words came out before Eli had fully thought them through. Not forever, necessarily, but through the winter at least. It's not safe to travel with a child in this weather anyway. And by spring, he trailed off, not sure how to finish. "By spring, what?" Hannah's voice was barely a whisper. "By spring, we can figure out what makes sense. For all of us." Hannah stared at him, something like hope blooming in her expression. "You'd really let us stay that long?" "I wouldn't offer if I didn't mean it." "But what will people in town say? A woman living on your ranch, no husband? Let them say what they want. I stopped caring what people thought a long time ago." Eli leaned forward, his voice earnest. "Hannah, I meant what I said. You're safe here, both of you. And if staying means you don't have to worry about where your next meal is coming from or whether you'll have a roof over your head, then that's what you should do." Tears spilled over onto Hannah's cheeks, but she was smiling through them. "I don't know how to thank you." "Then don't. Just stay. That's thanks enough." She reached out and squeezed his hand, the gesture so unexpected and genuine that Eli felt warmth spread through his chest. Her hand was small and work-roughened in his, but it felt right somehow. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll stay. Through the winter at least." Eli squeezed back, sealing the agreement. "Good." Samuel's laughter echoed from the hayloft above them, pure and joyful, and Eli thought that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand what it meant to build something new from broken pieces. Not a family, exactly. Not yet. But something close. Something worth protecting. Something that felt dangerously close to home. Winter settled over the high plains with a vengeance, bringing snow that piled in drifts against the barn and temperatures that made even Eli think twice before heading outside. But inside the ranch house, something warmer was taking root. 6 weeks had passed since that conversation in the barn, and the arrangement had evolved into something that felt less temporary with each passing day. Hannah had taken over most of the cooking and cleaning, not because Eli asked, but because she insisted on contributing. Samuel had appointed himself Eli's shadow, following him everywhere and asking endless questions about horses and ranching and why the sky was blue. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm, the three of them. Mornings began with breakfast together, then Eli and Samuel would head out to handle chores while Hannah managed the house. Evenings were spent around the fire, Samuel playing with the wooden toys Eli had started carving for him, Hannah mending clothes or reading from the few books Eli owned, and Eli himself finally relaxing instead of just existing. It felt like something Eli had stopped believing he could have. It felt like a life. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late January, delivered by the mail carrier who only made it out to the ranch once a month when the roads were passable. Eli took it without thinking much about it, probably something from town about taxes or supplies, and set it on the kitchen table while he stomped snow off his boots. Hannah was at the stove, stirring something that smelled like heaven. She glanced at the envelope and froze, her wooden spoon suspended in midair. All the color drained from her face. "Hannah?" Eli crossed to her side in 2 strides. "What is it?" She was staring at the letter like it was a snake coiled to strike. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, then pulled back. That's my handwriting, on the address." Eli looked closer. The envelope was addressed to him, but the script was different from the Postal Service's usual block letters, feminine and careful, with a slight slant to the right. "I don't understand," he said. Hannah set down the spoon with a clatter and wrapped her arms around herself. "Before I left, I wrote to someone, asking for help, asking if they knew anywhere safe I could go." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I gave them this address. I thought maybe they could send word if it was safe to come back, or where else I might go." Eli's stomach went cold. "Who did you write to?" "My cousin, Rebecca. She's the only family I have left who—" Hannah's breath hitched. "Who might actually help instead of telling me to go back and make things work?" "Open it," Eli said quietly, though every instinct was screaming that whatever was in that envelope was going to shatter the fragile peace they'd built. Hannah's hands shook as she broke the seal. The letter inside was short, written in hurried script that suggested the writer had been rushed or frightened. Hannah read it once, then again, her face going even paler. "What does it say?" Eli asked when she didn't speak. She handed him the letter silently. Eli read, "Hannah, if you get this, you need to disappear. Run as far as you can and don't tell anyone where you're going. Jacob found out you left. He's been asking questions, threatening people. He says Samuel is his property, his words, and that he has legal right to the boy since you were married in front of witnesses. He's got some lawyer helping him, someone who doesn't care about the truth. They've been to the sheriff. They've been to the judge. Jacob's telling everyone you kidnapped his son and that you're mentally unwell. Some people believe him. Please, Hannah, be careful. He's dangerous when he doesn't get what he wants. You know that better than anyone. Don't contact me again. I'm sorry, but I can't risk my own family. I hope you find safety. Rebecca." The letter fell from Eli's hands. He looked at Hannah, who had backed up against the wall like she needed something solid to keep her upright. "Jacob," she whispered. "That's Samuel's father. My husband. I hoped he'd just let us go, that he wouldn't care enough to come looking. But he did. He never cared about Sam. Never. But he can't stand losing, can't stand the idea that I might have gotten away from him." Her voice was rising, panic bleeding into every word. "And now he's got legal papers. He's got people believing his lies. He's going to—" She broke off, pressing her hands over her mouth to muffle a sob. Eli crossed to her in 2 strides and gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "You're safe here. Both of you. Whatever this Jacob wants, he's not getting it. You understand? You don't know him. You don't know what he's capable of. Then tell me." Eli's voice softened but remained steady. "Tell me what I'm dealing with." Hannah's eyes were wild with fear, but she nodded shakily. They sat at the table. Samuel was napping in the next room, thank goodness, and Hannah told her story in a halting voice that broke Eli's heart. She'd married Jacob Reed when she was 18, desperate to escape a father who drank too much and hit too hard. Jacob had seemed like salvation at first, charming, attentive, promising her a better life. But the mask had slipped within weeks of their wedding. Jacob was cruel in ways that left no visible marks most of the time. He controlled every aspect of Hannah's life, from what she ate to who she could speak to. When Samuel was born, Jacob had been furious that the child was a boy, ranting about not wanting competition for Hannah's attention. "He never hit Sam," Hannah said, her voice hollow, "but he made it clear that the boy was a burden, that we both were. He'd disappear for weeks at a time, come back drunk and angry, and take out his frustrations on me. Sam learned to hide when his father came home, learned to be invisible." "How'd you get away?" Eli asked, his jaw so tight it hurt. "Jacob left for a cattle drive last fall. Said he'd be gone for 2 months. I waited a week to make sure he wasn't coming back. Then I took what little money I'd managed to hide and ran. I thought if I could just get far enough away, he'd forget about us. Find some other woman to torment." She laughed bitterly. "I should have known better. Jacob doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive." Eli's hands curled into fists on the table. He'd met men like Jacob Reed during the war, small, mean-spirited bullies who enjoyed having power over people weaker than themselves. The kind of men who made the world a worse place just by existing in it. "He's not taking Samuel," Eli said flatly. "I don't care what papers he has or what lies he's told. That boy's not going back to him. But if he has legal right—" "Legal right?" Eli's voice hardened. "He terrorized you. He made your son so afraid he had to learn to be invisible. That's not a father. That's a monster." "The law doesn't care about that. The law says a husband has rights to his wife and children, regardless of how he treats them." Hannah's voice was bitter with the knowledge. "Women like me, we don't have any real recourse. We can't just leave. We can't take our children and disappear without consequences." "We'll find a way," Eli said with a certainty he didn't entirely feel. "There's always a way." Hannah looked at him with desperate hope. "You really think so?" "I know so, because I'm not letting anything happen to you or Sam. You have my word on that." The next 2 weeks were tense with waiting. Every sound of horses on the road made Hannah jump. Every stranger in town, when Eli went for supplies, made him scrutinize faces, looking for threats. He started keeping his rifle closer at hand, and at night he found himself lying awake, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Samuel noticed the change in atmosphere, the way his mother watched the windows with frightened eyes. He became clingy, not wanting Hannah out of his sight, and his nightmares returned, dreams that had him crying out in his sleep until Hannah or Eli came to soothe him. "Mama, are we leaving?" Samuel asked one morning while they were feeding the chickens. The question was small and scared, the voice of a child who'd learned that good things never lasted. "No, baby," Hannah said, pulling him close. "We're not leaving." "Promise?" Hannah's eyes met Eli's over the boy's head. There was a question in that look. "Can you promise him that? Can you keep us safe?" Eli nodded once, firm and certain. "Promise," Hannah whispered into Samuel's hair. The threat arrived on a cold afternoon in early February. Eli was in the barn, repairing a broken stall door, when he heard horses approaching. 3 riders, moving fast. He set down his tools and walked out to meet them, his hand instinctively checking for the knife at his belt. The lead rider was a man in his mid-30s, well-dressed in a way that suggested money and status. He had the kind of face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel set of his mouth and the cold calculation in his eyes. The 2 men flanking him looked like hired muscle, thick-necked and mean, the kind of men who did dirty work for pay. "Can I help you?" Eli asked, his voice neutral but his body tense. The lead rider's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for my wife, Hannah Reed. I have reason to believe she might be here." So this was Jacob Reed. Eli felt his dislike crystallize into something harder and more dangerous. "Don't know anyone by that name," Eli said evenly. Jacob's smile widened. "Now that's interesting, because I have a letter that suggests otherwise. A letter my wife wrote to her cousin, giving this address as a place she might seek refuge." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat, not the original letter, Eli noted, but a copy. "So let's try this again. Is my wife here?" "Like I said, I don't know anyone named Hannah Reed." One of the hired men shifted in his saddle, hand moving toward the gun at his hip. Eli didn't move, but his eyes tracked the gesture, calculating distances and odds. "You know, Jacob said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. Lying to me is a very bad idea. I'm a patient man, but I don't like being toyed with. My wife took something that belongs to me, and I want it back. Your wife, Eli said, his voice hard as iron. Or your son. Jacob's eyes flashed with something dark and ugly. Both. They're my property, and the law agrees with me. I have papers. He reached into his coat again, this time pulling out an official-looking document. From a judge in Kansas Territory. These papers give me full legal custody of my son and declare my wife mentally incompetent. So unless you want to be charged with harboring a fugitive and kidnapping, I suggest you hand them over right now. Behind Eli, he heard the barn door creak. He didn't turn, but he knew without looking that Hannah had come outside. He could feel her fear like a physical presence. Jacob. Hannah's voice was steady despite the tremor Eli could hear underneath. What are you doing here? Jacob's face transformed when he saw her, fury and possessiveness warring for dominance. What am I doing here? You ran away from your husband, you ungrateful bitch. You took my son. Did you really think I wouldn't come looking? Sam was never yours, Hannah said, and Eli heard the steel in her voice now, the strength she'd found in their weeks of safety. You never wanted him. You made that clear every day of his life. That's not for you to decide. He's my son, born in wedlock. That makes him my property under the law. Jacob swung down from his horse, his hired men following suit. Now you can come with me peacefully, or we can do this the hard way. But either way, you and the boy are leaving with me today. Eli stepped between Jacob and Hannah, his body a wall. Nobody's going anywhere. Jacob's eyes narrowed. And who exactly are you? The owner of this ranch, which means you're on my property without permission. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Not without my wife and son. Then I guess you're not leaving. The tension ratcheted up, deadly as a cocked gun. Jacob's hand moved toward his hip, and Eli's hand tightened on his knife. The two hired men fanned out, trying to flank them, and Eli calculated whether he could take all three before someone got hurt. You don't want to do this, Eli said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that came from years of command during the war. Whatever you think your rights are, I'm telling you now, you're not taking that woman or her boy. Not today. Not ever. You're harboring my property. She's a human being, not property. And that boy in there is 3 years old. You really want to traumatize him by dragging him away from the only safety he's ever known? Eli took a step forward, his voice dropping even lower. You really want to see what happens when you try? Jacob's face went red with rage. You threatening me? I'm stating facts. You ride onto my land making demands, you're going to find yourself in a world of trouble. I have legal documents. I don't care if you have a letter from the president himself. That woman and her child are under my protection now. You want to challenge that? You go ahead and try. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the air crackling with violence waiting to happen. Eli could see Jacob calculating, weighing his options, trying to decide if pushing this was worth the risk. Finally, Jacob smiled, a cold, cruel expression that promised this wasn't over. Fine. We'll do this the legal way. I'll be back with the sheriff and proper authorization. And when I come back, you're going to wish you'd just handed them over peacefully. He swung back onto his horse, his men following suit. But before he rode off, Jacob looked past Eli to where Hannah stood trembling. This isn't over, Hannah. You're my wife. Samuel is my son. And I always get what's mine. Always. His eyes flicked to Eli. And you're going to regret sticking your nose in family business. That's a promise. They rode off at a gallop, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a silence heavy with threat. Eli stood watching until they disappeared over the horizon, then turned to find Hannah collapsed against the barn wall, shaking so hard she could barely stand. He was beside her in an instant, his hand steadying her shoulders. Hey, look at me. Hannah, look at me. She raised her eyes to his, and the terror there nearly broke him. He's going to take Sam, she whispered. He's going to take my baby, and there's nothing I can do to stop him. The hell there isn't. Eli's voice was fierce. We're not giving up. We're not running. We're going to fight this the right way. How? You heard him. He has legal documents, papers from a judge. What can we possibly do against that? Eli's mind was already racing, putting together a plan. We go to the authorities first. We tell them the truth about what Jacob did to you. We get our own legal representation. We make sure the real story gets heard before Jacob can poison the well with his lies. And if that doesn't work, Eli's jaw tightened, then we'll figure out something else. But Hannah, I meant what I said. Nobody's taking Samuel, not while I'm breathing. Hannah searched his face, looking for false promises or empty platitudes. Whatever she saw there made something in her expression shift, fear still present but no longer overwhelming. Why? She asked, for what felt like the 100th time. Why are you doing this for us? Why risk so much? Eli thought about all the easy answers he could give. Because it was the right thing to do. Because no child should be forced back into a dangerous home. Because he couldn't stand by and watch innocent people get hurt. But those weren't the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated and more terrifying. Because somewhere along the way, Eli said slowly, you and Sam stopped being strangers passing through. You became... He stopped, struggling to articulate what he barely understood himself. You became important. You became people I care about. And I protect what's mine. Hannah's breath caught. Yours? If you'll have me standing beside you. If you'll let me help. Eli's hands tightened on her shoulders. I'm not asking for anything in return, Hannah. I'm not trying to replace Jacob or trap you in another situation you can't escape. I'm offering whatever support I can give. Legal, financial, physical. Whatever it takes to keep you and Sam safe. Tears spilled down Hannah's cheeks, but she was smiling through them. I don't deserve you. That's not true. You deserve someone who sees your worth. You deserve safety and peace and a chance to build a life without fear. Eli's voice softened. And Samuel deserves a childhood where he doesn't have to hide, where he can laugh and play and be a kid without worrying about his father's mood. You really think we can win this? I think we have to try. And I think that standing together, we've got a better chance than if you were facing this alone. Hannah nodded, squaring her shoulders in a way that reminded Eli of the woman who'd begged him for help on that trail months ago. She'd been desperate then, but she'd also been fierce. Now that fierceness was coming back, tempered by weeks of rest and safety into something harder and more resilient. Okay, she said. We fight together. Together, Eli echoed. They stood there for a moment longer, drawing strength from each other, before heading inside to explain to Samuel why those bad men had come and what they were going to do about it. The boy listened with solemn eyes, his small hand gripping his mother's tightly. When Eli finished explaining, Samuel looked up at him with absolute trust. You won't let them take me, right? You won't let Papa hurt Mama anymore? Eli crouched down so he was at the boy's eye level. No, Sam, I won't. That's a promise. Samuel threw his arms around Eli's neck, hugging him with the fierce desperation of a child who'd found an anchor in a storm. Over the boy's shoulder, Eli met Hannah's eyes and saw his own determination reflected back at him. They would fight this. They would win. Because failure wasn't an option when it meant losing the family he'd somehow, against all odds, been given a second chance to have. That night, after Samuel had finally fallen asleep, after being checked on 3 times because he was afraid the bad men would come back, Eli and Hannah sat at the kitchen table making plans. They would ride into town first thing in the morning. They would find a lawyer, explain the situation, get ahead of whatever lies Jacob was spreading. They would gather testimony from people who'd seen Hannah's condition when she arrived. They would build a case. What if it's not enough? Hannah asked quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Then we'll figure out something else, Eli said. But even as he spoke, a cold weight settled in his gut. Because the truth was, the law often favored men like Jacob Reed, men with money and connections and the ability to make people believe their version of events. And women like Hannah, women who dared to leave, who dared to protect their children, often found themselves with no good options. But Eli wasn't about to let that happen. Not this time. Not to Hannah and Samuel. Whatever it took, he'd find a way to keep them safe. even if it meant putting everything he had on the line. They left for town at dawn. The three of them bundled against the cold in the wagon Eli had loaded with blankets and supplies. Samuel sat between them, unusually quiet, his small hand gripping his mother's tightly. The boy had barely slept, startling awake every few hours, convinced the bad men were back. Each time, Hannah had held him close and whispered reassurances until he drifted off again, but the fear lingered in his eyes like a shadow. The ride to High Plains took 3 hours over roads still packed with snow. Hannah spent most of it staring straight ahead, her jaw set with determination even as her hands trembled in her lap. Eli wanted to reach over and take one of those hands, wanted to tell her everything would be all right, but he couldn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. High Plains wasn't much of a town, a main street with maybe 20 buildings, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and the courthouse that doubled as the sheriff's office. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant Jacob's arrival hadn't gone unnoticed. As Eli pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the courthouse, he could feel eyes on them from every direction. "Stay close," he murmured to Hannah as he helped her down. "Don't let anyone separate you from Sam." She nodded, pulling the boy against her side. Samuel buried his face in her skirt, overwhelmed by the attention. The courthouse was a simple wooden building with a pot-bellied stove in the corner and a clerk's desk near the door. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from curious to wary when he saw Hannah. "Can I help you?" His tone suggested he'd rather not. "We need to speak with Judge Morrison," Eli said firmly. It's urgent." "The judge is busy with another matter." "Then we'll wait." Eli didn't move from his position blocking the door. "This concerns legal custody and false claims. The judge will want to hear it." The clerk's mouth thinned, but he disappeared through a side door. They could hear voices, one raised in anger, and then Jacob Reed emerged from the judge's chambers, his face flushed with triumph. He stopped dead when he saw them. "Well, well," Jacob said, his voice dripping with false civility. "How convenient. Saved me the trouble of coming back out to that ranch with the sheriff." He turned back toward the chambers. "Your Honor, if you'd like to see the woman and child in question, they're right here." Judge Morrison appeared in the doorway, a heavy-set man in his 60s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, his gaze lingering on Samuel's frightened face pressed against Hannah's skirt. "Everyone in my chambers," he said shortly. "Now." The judge's chambers were cramped and cluttered with law books and papers. Morrison took a seat behind a massive oak desk, while Jacob positioned himself near the window, flanked by his 2 hired men who'd waited outside. Eli stood beside Hannah, close enough that their shoulders touched, a silent show of solidarity. "Mr. Reed has brought serious accusations," Morrison began, looking at Hannah. "He claims you took his son without permission and that you're mentally unstable. He has documents here." He tapped a stack of papers on his desk. "From a judge in Kansas Territory declaring him the sole legal guardian and you incompetent to care for the child." "That's a lie," Hannah said, her voice shaking but clear. "Those papers are based on testimony from people who never met me, who only knew what Jacob told them. I left because my husband was—" She glanced at Samuel, choosing her words carefully, "because he made our home unsafe." Jacob laughed, a harsh sound. "Unsafe. I provided for you. I gave you a home, food, everything a wife could want. And this is how you repay me? By stealing my son and running off with—" His eyes flicked to Eli with contempt. "Some stranger?" "Mr. Crowder is not a stranger," Hannah said firmly. "He gave us shelter when we had nowhere else to go. He's been nothing but kind." "I'm sure he has been," Jacob interrupted, his tone insinuating. "Very kind, I imagine. Tell me, Your Honor, does it seem proper for a married woman to be living alone with another man, sleeping under his roof? What kind of example is that for a child?" Eli's hands clenched into fists, but Morrison held up a hand before he could speak. "That's enough, Mr. Reed. Let's stick to the facts." The judge turned to Hannah. "Why did you leave your husband?" Hannah took a breath, and Eli could see her gathering her courage. "Because he hurt me. Not where it would show, mostly. He was careful about that. But he made sure I knew my place. He said I was worthless, that I was lucky he'd married me at all. When Samuel was born, he said, her voice caught. He said the boy was a mistake, an unwanted burden. He ignored Sam completely unless the child made too much noise, and then he'd... She's lying, Jacob said coldly, making up stories to justify her theft. Your Honor, I've brought witnesses who can attest to my character, men who've done business with me, who know me to be a reasonable, upstanding citizen. My wife, on the other hand, has always been prone to hysteria and wild imagination. It's why I had her evaluated in the first place. Evaluated by a doctor you paid? Hannah shot back, her fear transforming into anger. A man who spent 10 minutes asking me questions and then declared me unfit based on nothing but your word. Morrison studied the papers in front of him, his expression unreadable. Mr. Reed, these documents do seem somewhat irregular. The testimony is all second-hand and there's no actual medical evaluation recorded here. Just an affidavit from one doctor, Caldwell, stating that based on your reports of your wife's behavior, he believes she may be mentally unstable. That's because she ran before a proper evaluation could be conducted, Jacob said smoothly. I was trying to get her help, Your Honor, trying to do right by my family, and she repaid me by kidnapping my son and disappearing in the night. I didn't kidnap him. He's my child, too. I was protecting him. From what? A father who provided for him? Who wanted to raise him proper? Jacob's voice rose. You had no right to take him. No right to deny me my son. You never wanted him. Hannah's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face. You made that clear every single day. You treated him like he was invisible when you bothered to acknowledge him at all. You made me so afraid that I slept with a chair against the door every night. You made Sam so terrified that he learned to hide when he heard your footsteps. Lies, Jacob hissed. All lies. Your Honor, surely you can see this woman is unstable. Look at her. Hysterical, making wild accusations. This is exactly the behavior that concerned me. Eli couldn't stay silent anymore. Judge Morrison, if I may speak? The judge looked at him. And you are? Eli Crowder. I own the ranch where Mrs. Reed and her son have been staying. I found them on the trail in November. The boy was burning with fever, and Mrs. Reed had walked until she collapsed. She wasn't running from a good situation, Your Honor. She was running for her life. He knows nothing about our marriage, Jacob said dismissively. He's been taken in by her lies, just like she's trying to take you in now. For all we know, he's been compensated for providing this testimony. Nobody's paying me to tell the truth, Eli said, his voice hard as iron. I'm here because I've spent 3 months watching that boy learn how to be a child again. Learning that it's safe to laugh, safe to play, safe to exist without fear. And I've watched Mrs. Reed transform from a woman who is starving herself to make sure her son ate into someone who can sleep through the night without nightmares. That doesn't happen when you're running from a good situation. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. These are serious accusations on both sides. Mrs. Reed, you claim your husband was abusive. Mr. Reed, you claim your wife is mentally unstable and kidnapped your son. Without clear evidence either way, I'm inclined to— There's evidence, Hannah interrupted. She reached up and unbuttoned the top of her dress with shaking hands. Eli started to look away, but she caught his arm. No, I need you to see. I need everyone to see. She pulled the fabric aside, revealing her shoulder and the top of her chest. Even in the dim light of the chambers, the scars were visible, faint white lines that crisscrossed her skin in a pattern that was clearly deliberate. Not the marks of accidents or falls, but the precise, methodical damage of someone who'd known exactly where to hurt without leaving obvious traces. The room went deathly silent. He used a belt, Hannah said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Sometimes his fists, always where the bruises wouldn't show, always where I could cover them up. He said, her voice broke. He said it was to teach me to be a proper wife, to teach me obedience. Jacob's face had gone pale, then red with fury. You can't prove those are from me. For all anyone knows, you did that to yourself to make me look bad. I have more, Hannah said, her hands moving to the buttons at her wrist. Do you want to see them all? Every mark, every scar. Should I tell the judge about the time you broke my ribs because dinner wasn't ready when you wanted it? Or the time you held my hand over the stove because I'd spoken back to you? Enough, Morrison said, his voice sharp. He was staring at Hannah's shoulder with an expression that suggested he'd seen enough to make up his mind. Mrs. Reed, you can button your dress. Hannah's hands trembled so badly she couldn't manage the buttons. Eli stepped in, his fingers gentle as he helped her, his jaw so tight he thought his teeth might crack. Behind them he could hear Jacob breathing hard, the sound of a man whose carefully constructed lies were falling apart. Morrison turned to Jacob, his expression cold. Mr. Reed, these documents from Kansas Territory hold no weight in Wyoming. And even if they did, what I'm seeing here suggests that any evaluation of Mrs. Reed's mental state was influenced by your own account of events that appear to have been grossly misrepresented. Your Honor, you can't possibly believe her over me. I'm a respected businessman. She's just a hysterical woman, a woman with scars that tell a very different story than yours. Morrison's voice was sharp enough to cut. I've been a judge for 20 years, Mr. Reed. I've seen enough abused women to recognize the signs, and I've seen enough men like you, men who think their wives are property to be disciplined, to know when I'm being lied to. Jacob's face twisted with rage. You're taking her word over mine? Over legal documents? I'm taking evidence over falsified paperwork. There's a difference. Morrison pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. I'm issuing a temporary ruling granting Mrs. Reed full custody of the child. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing you from approaching Mrs. Reed or her son. If you violate either of these orders, you'll be arrested. This is outrageous. She's my wife. That's my son. That boy, Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through Jacob's protests, is a human being, not property. And your wife is also a human being who has the right to live without fear of violence. My ruling stands. Jacob stood there, fury and disbelief warring on his face. For a moment, Eli thought the man might lunge across the desk at the judge. His hired men shifted closer, hands moving toward their guns, and Eli's hand dropped to his own weapon. But Morrison had already pulled open his desk drawer, revealing his own pistol lying ready. Don't even think about it, the judge said calmly. I may be old, but I can still shoot straight. Now you and your men are going to leave my office, leave this town, and leave Mrs. Reed alone. If I hear you violated this order, I'll have you arrested and tried for assault. Are we clear? Jacob's hands were shaking with barely contained rage. This isn't over. I'll appeal. I'll take this to a higher court. You do that. But until then, my ruling stands. Morrison turned to Hannah. Mrs. Reed, do you wish to file for divorce? Hannah's eyes widened. I can do that? On grounds of cruelty and abuse, yes. It will take time, and it won't be easy. But Wyoming Territory has more progressive laws than Kansas regarding women's rights. You have options here that you might not have had elsewhere. Yes, Hannah whispered. Yes, I want a divorce. Morrison made another note. I'll have the paperwork drawn up. You'll need to sign it, and we'll need testimony. Mr. Crowder's statement will be helpful, and if there are others who can speak to your condition when you arrived, that would strengthen your case. The mail carrier saw her, Eli said, and the woman who runs the general store. She saw the state of Mrs. Reed's dress when we came in for supplies that first week. Good. Gather those testimonies. Morrison looked at Jacob, who stood frozen with impotent fury. Mr. Reed, you're dismissed. I suggest you leave town before I change my mind about arresting you for fraud. Jacob's eyes blazed with hatred as they swept over Hannah, then Eli. You think this is over? You think you've won? I'll destroy you for this, both of you. You have no idea what you've done. I know exactly what I've done, Hannah said, her voice stronger than Eli had ever heard it. I've protected my son from a man who saw him as property. I've chosen safety over submission, and I've stopped being afraid of you. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Jacob took a step forward, his face contorted with rage, and Eli moved to intercept him. But Morrison was already standing, his pistol now visible on the desk. Leave. Now. For a long moment, Jacob stood there, his whole body vibrating with fury. Then he spun on his heel and stalked out, his hired men following. They could hear him shouting threats as he mounted his horse, could hear the thunder of hooves as they rode out of town at a gallop. The silence that followed felt enormous. Hannah swayed on her feet, and Eli caught her before she could fall. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation finally draining away. Samuel, who'd been silent throughout the entire ordeal, pressed against his mother's legs and began to cry. Not loud, wrenching sobs, but quiet tears of relief and confusion. "It's over," Hannah whispered against Eli's shoulder. "It's really over?" "The first part is," Eli said quietly, "but we need to be careful. A man like Jacob doesn't give up that easy." Morrison was already writing out additional documents. "Mr. Crowder's right to be cautious. I've seen men like Reed before. They don't take well to being told no, especially not by women they consider their property." He looked up at Hannah. "You should stay somewhere safe while the divorce proceedings move forward, somewhere he can't find you easily." "She can stay at my ranch," Eli said. "She's been there for months already. It's isolated enough that he'd have trouble approaching without being seen." "Good. And Mr. Crowder?" Morrison's eyes were sharp. "I'm assuming you're prepared to protect them if Reed decides to ignore my order." "Yes, sir." "I am." Morrison nodded slowly. "I thought so. Just make sure it doesn't come to violence if it can be avoided. The law's on your side now, but that can change quickly if things get messy." They left the courthouse an hour later with signed documents and a date for the divorce hearing in 6 weeks. The town was still watching. Eli could feel the weight of dozens of eyes. But he didn't care. Let them look. Let them talk. Hannah and Samuel were safe, and that was all that mattered. Hannah was silent on the ride back to the ranch, her arm wrapped tight around Samuel. The boy had finally stopped crying and fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted by the emotional turmoil. Eli kept the wagon moving at a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. "Thank you," Hannah said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the creak of the wagon wheels. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do. You stood up for us. You put yourself at risk." "Hannah." Eli pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. "I meant what I said back at the ranch. You and Sam, you're not obligations or burdens. He struggled to find the right words. You're people I care about, people I want to protect. That's not charity or duty. That's what you do for people who matter." Hannah's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. "You matter to us too. To me. More than I know how to say." Something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but profound. A recognition that what had started as a desperate plea for help had transformed into something neither of them had expected, something that felt like the foundation of a new beginning. "We should get home," Eli said softly, but he didn't move, couldn't seem to make himself break the moment. Hannah reached out and took his hand, squeezing gently. "Home. I like the sound of that." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, Samuel sleeping peacefully between them and the winter sun slowly sinking toward the horizon. And if Eli kept glancing back over his shoulder, watching for riders that never appeared, neither of them mentioned it. Because they both knew that while they'd won the first battle, the war might not be over yet. But for now, for this moment, they had safety, they had hope, and they had each other. And sometimes, that was enough to face whatever came next. The ranch appeared in the distance like a promise, smoke rising from the chimney into the darkening sky. Hannah's grip on Samuel tightened, and Eli could see the relief in her face, the bone-deep gratitude of someone who'd finally found a place where she could rest. "We're home," she whispered, and Eli felt those words settle into his chest like a benediction. Home. After 5 years of an empty house and a half-lived life, Eli finally understood what that word meant again, and he'd protect them, with everything he had, no matter what Jacob Reed or anyone else tried to do. That was a promise he intended to keep. The first week after the courthouse felt like walking on eggshells. Every sound made Hannah jump. Every shadow outside the window had her reaching for Samuel. Eli found himself checking the perimeter of the ranch 3 times a day, his rifle always within reach. They were waiting for Jacob to make good on his threats, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But days passed with no sign of him. No riders on the horizon, no letters threatening legal action, no midnight attacks. Just silence, the kind that felt more ominous than reassuring. "Maybe he gave up," Hannah said one evening as they sat by the fire after Samuel had gone to bed. But her voice held no conviction, and her hands were twisted together in her lap. Men like Jacob don't give up, Eli said quietly. They just get smarter about how they fight. Hannah nodded, her face pale. I keep waiting for him to appear, keep thinking I'll wake up and find him standing over my bed, or that he'll... She stopped, her voice catching. I know the judge ruled in my favor. I know the law is on my side now, but paper doesn't stop a man who's convinced he's right. Eli set down the piece of wood he'd been whittling, another toy for Samuel, this one meant to be a dog, and moved to sit beside her. He'd have to get through me first, and I promise you, that's not happening. But what if he comes with more men? What if he... Hannah... Eli took her trembling hands in his, steadying them. Look at me. Whatever happens, we face it together. You're not alone in this anymore. She met his eyes, and Eli saw the war happening there. The part of her that wanted to believe him fighting against years of learning that promises couldn't be trusted. That safety was always temporary. I've never had someone stand with me before, she whispered. Even my own family. They told me marriage was forever, that I'd made my bed and had to lie in it, that a wife's duty was to endure. That's not duty, that's surrender. Eli's voice was fierce. And you're not built for surrendering. You walked until you collapsed to save your son. You stood in front of a judge and showed your scars. You chose fight over flight even when you were terrified. That's not a woman who gives up. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I had help. I had you. We had each other, Eli corrected. That's what makes the difference. The moment stretched between them, heavy with words neither quite knew how to say. Eli was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of how Hannah's hands felt in his, small and work-roughened but strong. He could see the pulse beating in her throat, could smell the lavender soap she'd started using now that they had money for such luxuries. For the first time in 5 years, Eli felt something stir in his chest that wasn't grief or guilt, something that felt like possibility. But before he could examine that feeling too closely, a sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps on the porch, heavy and deliberate. Eli was on his feet in an instant, his hand on the rifle mounted above the mantel. Hannah had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the door. The footsteps stopped, and for a heartbeat there was nothing but the crackle of the fire and the hammering of Eli's pulse. Then came a knock. Not the aggressive pounding Eli had expected, but a measured, almost hesitant sound. "Mr. Crowder?" A voice called through the door. "It's Sheriff Coleman from town. I need to speak with you." Eli and Hannah exchanged glances. The sheriff. That could mean a dozen things, none of them good. Eli kept the rifle in his hands as he opened the door. Sheriff Coleman was a barrel-chested man in his 50s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. He stood on the porch alone, his hands visible and empty, his expression carefully neutral. "Evening, Sheriff," Eli said, not lowering the gun. "What brings you out here?" "Can I come in? This isn't a conversation for the porch." Eli stepped aside, letting Coleman enter. The sheriff's eyes swept the room, taking in Hannah's frightened face and the protective way Eli positioned himself between her and the door. "Mrs. Reed," Coleman nodded to her. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just need to share some information." "What kind of information?" Eli asked, his voice hard. Coleman sighed, removing his hat. "It's about Jacob Reed. He's dead." The words hit like a physical blow. Hannah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Eli felt his grip tighten on the rifle, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. "What happened?" he managed. "He rode out of town after that hearing, angrier than a rattlesnake. Headed east toward Kansas territory, we thought. But apparently, he stopped at the saloon in Laramie, got drunk, and started running his mouth about how he'd been wronged. Started talking about how he was going to come back here with real men and real guns and take what was his." Coleman's expression was grim. "Man named Patterson was in that saloon. Lost his own daughter to her husband's fists a few years back. Couldn't save her. I guess hearing Reed talk that way about his own wife and child, it didn't sit well." "Patterson killed him?" Hannah's voice was barely a whisper. "Drew on him in the street. Reed was drunk and slow. Patterson wasn't." Coleman looked at Hannah with something that might have been sympathy. "I know this is a shock, ma'am, but I thought you should hear it from me rather than through gossip. Reed died instantly. didn't suffer. Hannah sank into the chair, her face blank with shock. Eli set the rifle aside and moved to her side, his hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him with eyes that held a dozen emotions: relief, guilt, disbelief, and underneath it all, the first stirrings of something that might eventually become freedom. "There's more," Coleman continued. Patterson turned himself in, gave his statement. When word got around about what Reed had said, about how he'd planned to violate the judge's order and take you by force, well, let's just say there wasn't much appetite for prosecution. Judge Morrison ruled it self-defense. Patterson's been released. Self-defense? Eli frowned. Reed was unarmed and drunk. Reed made threats against a woman and child under court protection. Patterson acted to prevent a crime. That's how the judge saw it, and that's how the law's going to see it. Coleman's eyes met Eli's, and something passed between them, an understanding that justice didn't always look like the law books said it should. "Mrs. Reed, you're a widow now. You're free, and your son is safe." The words seemed to echo in the silent room. Free, safe. Concepts that had seemed impossible just hours ago, now offered up as simple fact. "What about his family?" Hannah asked suddenly. "Jacob's people back in Kansas. Will they come for Sam?" "Reed's father died years ago, and his mother remarried and moved west. No siblings. The land he claimed was all debt. Nobody's coming for your boy, Mrs. Reed. Nobody has any claim to him but you." Hannah made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Her hands were shaking as she covered her face, and Eli could see her shoulders heaving with the weight of relief and shock and emotions she didn't know how to process. Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "I'll leave you folks to process this. But Mrs. Reed, you'll need to come by the courthouse sometime this week to sign some papers. Formalize things legally. And if you need anything, she'll be fine," Eli said firmly. "We'll take care of everything. Thank you for riding out to tell us, Sheriff." Coleman nodded and showed himself out, closing the door quietly behind him. Eli stood there for a moment, his hand still on Hannah's shoulder, trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. Jacob Reed was dead. The threat was gone. Hannah and Samuel were free. Just like that, everything had changed. Hannah was still crying silently, her whole body shaking. Eli knelt beside her chair, his hands gentle on her arms. "Hannah, look at me." She raised her head, tears streaming down her face. "He's gone. He's really gone. I'm free." "You're free," Eli confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know how to feel. I should be happy, shouldn't I? I should be celebrating that he can't hurt us anymore. But I just feel," she gestured helplessly, "empty. Like I've been holding my breath for so long that I've forgotten how to breathe normally." "It's going to take time," Eli said quietly. "You've been afraid for so long your body doesn't know how to stop. But you will. You'll learn what it feels like to live without fear. You and Sam, both." Hannah reached out and cupped Eli's face with one trembling hand. "Because of you. You gave us that. You gave us a place to heal. I just gave you shelter. You did the rest. You fought for your son. You stood up to Jacob. You survived." "We survived," Hannah corrected, echoing his words from weeks ago. "Together." They stayed like that for a long moment, kneeling together by the fire, processing the impossible reality of their new situation. Eventually, Hannah wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "I should check on Sam, make sure he's still sleeping through all this." She slipped away to the bedroom, and Eli heard her soft voice murmuring to the boy, reassuring him that everything was all right. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark landscape. Somewhere out there, a man was dead because he'd threatened Hannah and Samuel. Somewhere out there, justice had been served in the most final way possible. Eli waited for guilt to come, for some moral reckoning about being grateful for another man's death. But all he felt was relief, bone-deep, overwhelming relief that the threat was gone and the people under his protection were safe. When Hannah returned, her face was calmer, more composed. "He's still asleep, didn't wake at all." "That's good. Tomorrow will be soon enough to tell him." "How do I tell a 3-year-old that his father is dead?" Hannah's voice broke. How do I explain that the man who scared him so badly is gone forever without making him think death is something to celebrate? You tell him the truth, as much as he can understand. You tell him that his father is gone and can't hurt anyone anymore. You tell him he's safe. Eli moved closer to her. And you let him feel however he needs to feel. Some kids who lose abusive parents mourn them anyway. Some feel relief. Some don't understand what it means. However Sam reacts, it's valid. Hannah nodded, her expression thoughtful. You're good at this, at knowing what to say. You would have been a good father. The words hit harder than Eli expected. He turned away, his throat tight. I tried to be. Never got the chance to find out if I'd have been any good at it. Hannah was beside him in an instant, her hand finding his. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. It's all right. Eli's voice was rough. It's been 5 years. I should be past it by now. Grief doesn't work on a schedule. You taught me that. Hannah squeezed his hand. Your wife and child, they were lucky to have been loved by you, even if it was cut short. Eli looked down at their joined hands, at the way Hannah's fingers laced through his like they belonged there. Sometimes I think about what life might have been like if Sarah had lived, if our baby had been born healthy, what kind of father I'd have been, what kind of family we'd have made. You'd have been wonderful, Hannah said with absolute certainty. You are wonderful. The way you've been with Sam, patient and kind, and teaching him that men can be safe. That's fathering, Eli. You're already doing it. The words settled over him like a blanket, warming something that had been cold for too long. Eli found himself thinking about the past 3 months, about how natural it had felt to have Samuel following him around the ranch, asking questions and learning, about how right it felt to sit down to dinner with Hannah and the boy every evening, to hear Samuel's laughter, to see Hannah smile. I never planned for this, he said quietly. Never planned to let anyone close again. It was safer that way. Safer, Hannah echoed, but not better. Not really living. No, not really living. Eli turned to face her fully, his heart hammering in his chest. Hannah, I need to tell you something. I need to say it now before I lose my nerve or convince myself it's too soon or that you don't. He stopped, taking a breath. When you and Sam came into my life, I told myself it was temporary, that I was just helping someone in need and then you'd move on. But somewhere along the way, that changed. You changed something in me. Made me remember what it feels like to have a reason to wake up in the morning, to have people who matter. Hannah's eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted. Eli, I'm not asking for anything, he continued quickly. I'm not trying to replace Jacob or trap you in something you don't want. You're free now, really free. You can go anywhere, do anything, and if that's what you want, I'll help you. I'll give you money for a fresh start, help you find a place in town, whatever you need. But if, his voice caught, if there's any part of you that wants to stay, not because you have to, but because you want to, then I'm asking you to consider it. Consider staying here, with me, not as a guest or someone I'm helping, but as my family. The silence that followed felt endless. Hannah stood there, tears streaming down her face again, but she was smiling through them, the kind of smile that transformed her entire face into something luminous. You think I don't know that already? She whispered. You think I haven't been lying awake every night for weeks, trying to figure out how to tell you that I don't want to leave? That the idea of taking Sam and going somewhere else feels like cutting off a limb? Eli's breath caught. Hannah, I love you, she said, the words tumbling out like they'd been held back too long. I don't know when it happened. Maybe that first night when you gave us shelter without asking questions. Maybe when you stood up to Jacob in the courthouse. Maybe every moment in between. But I love you, Eli Crowder, not because you saved us, but because you showed us what it means to be chosen, to be valued, to be... Her voice broke. To be loved without conditions or fear. Eli closed the distance between them in one step, pulling her into his arms. She came willingly, her body fitting against his like it had been made to be there. He could feel her trembling, could feel his own heart racing against her cheek. I love you too, he said into her hair. Both of you, you and Sam, you've become my family, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you. Hannah pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining. Then you won't. We're not going anywhere. This is home. You're home. Eli cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Are you sure? You're free now, Hannah. Really free. You could go anywhere, start fresh. I am starting fresh, right here, with you. Her smile was radiant. I spent so many years being afraid, being controlled, being told I was worthless. And then I found you, and you showed me what I could be. What Sam could be. You gave us space to heal, to grow, to become whole again. Why would I leave that? Because staying means tying yourself to a man again. Means risking. You're not Jacob, Hannah interrupted firmly. You've never been Jacob. You've never made me feel small or afraid or worthless. You've made me feel seen, valued, safe. That's not something I want to walk away from. Eli felt something in his chest crack open, the last wall he'd built around his heart finally crumbling. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, full of promise and possibility. Hannah's hands came up to grip his shoulders, anchoring herself to him as the kiss deepened. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eli rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said, not right away. Not until you've had time to be free, to be just Hannah without anyone's claim on you. But eventually, when you're ready, marry me. Make this official. Make us a real family. Hannah laughed, the sound bright with joy. We're already a real family, Eli. But yes, I'll marry you. When I'm ready, when the divorce is final, and I've had time to just be me. Yes. They stood there in the firelight, holding each other, and Eli felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. He felt whole. He felt complete. He felt like he'd finally come home. A small voice from the hallway made them both turn. Samuel stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Mama? Why are you crying? Are you sad? Hannah laughed and held out her arms. Samuel ran to her and she scooped him up, holding him close. No, baby, I'm not sad. I'm happy. Very, very happy. Happy crying? Samuel looked confused, then his gaze shifted to Eli. Is it because of Eli? Yes, Hannah said simply. Because of Eli. Samuel considered this, then reached out to Eli with one small hand. Are you going to be my papa now? My real papa? Eli's throat went tight. He took the boy's hand gently. Would you want that, Sam? Yeah, Samuel said with the absolute certainty of childhood. You're nice, and you make Mama smile. That's what papas should do, right? Right, Eli agreed, his voice rough with emotion. He pulled both Hannah and Samuel into his arms, holding them close. That's exactly what papas should do. They stood there together, the three of them, and Eli felt the last pieces of his broken heart finally click back into place. Not the same as before, not unmarked by loss, but whole in a new way, stronger for having been broken and healed. The next morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight streaming through the windows and painting everything gold. Eli woke to the sound of Hannah humming in the kitchen and Samuel's laughter echoing from the barn where he'd gone to feed the chickens. Normal sounds, family sounds. He got up and dressed, then stood at the window looking out at his land, at the ranch he'd built with his own hands as a monument to loss. But it didn't feel like that anymore. Now it felt like possibility, like a future he hadn't dared to hope for. Hannah appeared in the doorway, flower on her hands and a smile on her face. Breakfast is almost ready, and Sam wants to know if you'll teach him how to saddle a horse today. Course I will. Eli crossed to her, dropping a kiss on her forehead that felt natural as breathing. We've got all the time in the world now. All the time in the world, Hannah echoed. I still can't quite believe it. That we're safe, that we're free, that we're... She gestured at the space between them, at the life they were building. That we get to be happy. Believe it, Eli said firmly. This is real. We're real, and we're going to make this work. Over the following weeks, they settled into a new rhythm. Hannah signed the papers at the courthouse, officially becoming a widow with full custody of her son. She filed for a legal name change, reclaiming her maiden name and giving Samuel a fresh start without Jacob's shadow hanging over him. The town gradually accepted that Hannah and Samuel were permanent fixtures at the Crowder Ranch, and if there was gossip about impropriety, it was mild and short-lived. Samuel thrived. He grew taller and stronger, his face filling out with proper meals and his fears slowly fading into memory. He followed Eli everywhere, learning to ride and rope and care for the animals. His laughter became a regular sound around the ranch, and sometimes Eli would catch himself standing still just to listen to it, marveling at how much life one small boy could bring to a place. Hannah bloomed. Without fear weighing her down, she transformed from the desperate woman on the trail into someone confident and capable. She took over managing the house completely, but not out of obligation, out of pride in creating a home. She started a garden, planning for spring planting. She made friends in town, slowly building a community that accepted her for who she was rather than who she'd been forced to be. And Eli learned how to live again, really live, not just survive. He learned that opening his heart to love again didn't diminish what he'd felt for Sarah, but honored it by proving he was capable of moving forward. He learned that family wasn't just blood, but the people you chose to stand beside through everything life threw at you. 6 months after Jacob's death, on a warm spring evening when the prairie was covered in wildflowers, Eli and Hannah were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Judge Morrison officiated, and the handful of friends they'd made in town attended. Samuel stood between them, holding both their hands, beaming with pride at his role in bringing them together. "Do you, Eli Crowder, take Hannah to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Morrison asked. "I do," Eli said, looking into Hannah's eyes and seeing his whole future there. "And do you, Hannah Reed, take Eli to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Hannah said, her voice clear and strong and free. "Then by the power vested in me by Wyoming territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Eli did, to applause and cheers from their small gathering. When they broke apart, Samuel was jumping up and down with excitement. "Does this mean Eli's my papa for real now?" he asked loudly. "For real," Hannah confirmed, laughing. "Good!" Samuel threw his arms around Eli's legs. "I love you, Papa." Those 3 words Eli had thought he'd never hear, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He scooped the boy up, holding him close as his vision blurred with tears. "I love you too, Sam," he managed. "I love you so much." As the sun set over the high plains that evening, the 3 of them stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sky turn gold and crimson. Hannah was tucked against Eli's side, her head on his shoulder. Samuel sat on the porch rail between them, chattering excitedly about the cake they were going to have at dinner. "Happy?" Eli asked Hannah quietly. She turned to look up at him, her eyes shining. "More than I ever thought possible. You gave me everything, Eli. Safety, freedom, love, a home." "You gave me the same," Eli said. "I was barely living before you and Sam showed up. Just going through the motions. You reminded me what it means to have something worth protecting, something worth fighting for." "We reminded each other," Hannah corrected. She stood on her toes and kissed him softly. "Thank you for seeing me that night on the trail. Thank you for stopping instead of riding past. Thank you for being brave enough to ask for help. Thank you for trusting me when you had no reason to." Samuel made a face. "Are you two going to be mushy all the time now that you're married?" They both laughed. "Probably," Eli admitted, ruffling the boy's hair. "Gross," Samuel said, but he was grinning. He looked out at the prairie, then back at his parents. "Can we stay here forever? I don't want to leave ever again." "We're not going anywhere," Hannah assured him. "This is our home now, all 3 of us." "Promise?" Eli and Hannah exchanged glances, then looked at their son with matching expressions of love and certainty. "Promise," they said together. As night fell over the ranch, Eli stood with his family around him and felt peace settle into his bones. The house that had been empty for so long was full of life now. The land that had felt like a refuge from the world had become a foundation for building something new. They'd all been broken in different ways. They'd all survived things they shouldn't have had to survive. But somehow, impossibly, they'd found each other. And in finding each other, they'd found a way to be whole again. Hannah had arrived on that frozen trail begging for someone to feed her child, insisting she didn't need anything for herself. But Eli had seen through that desperate plea to the truth underneath. She'd needed everything. Safety, shelter, kindness, and most importantly, someone who saw her worth and chose to stand beside her. And Eli, who'd convinced himself he was better off alone, had needed them just as desperately. Needed to be reminded what it felt like to have a purpose. Needed to learn that loving again wasn't a betrayal of the past, but an honoring of it. They hadn't saved each other. They'd chosen each other. And that made all the difference. As they headed inside for their wedding celebration, just the three of them and a few close friends, exactly as they wanted, Eli took one last look at the land spreading out under the stars. This ranch had been his sanctuary once, his hiding place, his way of shutting out the world and all its pain. But now it was something better. It was a home, a place where a desperate mother and her sick child had found safety, a place where a broken man had learned to love again, a place where three people who'd been lost had finally found where they belonged. And as laughter spilled out from the house into the night air, mixing with music and the sounds of celebration, Eli smiled and closed the door behind him. This was what healing looked like. This was what starting over meant. This was what happened when you opened your heart to possibility, even when everything in your past told you it was safer to stay closed. It was messy and imperfect and nothing like what any of them had planned. It was absolutely everything they needed. And it was theirs, built on trust and courage, and the simple, profound truth that sometimes the family you choose is the one that saves you in all the ways that matter. Hannah caught his hand as he came inside, pulling him into the warmth and light. Samuel was already pestering their guests for cake, his energy boundless, and his smile bright enough to chase away any remaining shadows. "You all right?" Hannah asked, reading something in Eli's expression. He looked at her, at this woman who'd been prepared to starve herself to feed her child, who'd walked until she collapsed rather than stay in a dangerous situation, who'd found the courage to love again even after everything she'd survived, and felt his heart swell with gratitude and awe. "I'm more than all right," he said. "I'm home." And he was. After 5 years of wandering through his own life like a ghost, Eli Crowder had finally come home. Not to a place, but to people. To the family that had arrived, broken on his doorstep, and somehow made him whole again in the process of healing themselves. It wasn't the life he'd planned. It wasn't the family he'd expected. But it was his. And it was real. And it was more than he'd ever dared to hope for. That was more than enough. That was everything.